The 1920s is sometimes called the prosperity decade because the economy genuinely looked really good. There was a lot of growth throughout the decade. I think the economy went up something like 40%, which is massive for such a short period of time. And it was hailed as a new era of the economy. People genuinely talked about the economy like it would forever go up. And it was a new era because there were not going to be any more collapses, which is ironic because it'll obviously end in the worst collapse. But there were a lot of very exciting things for people living at the time. And uh, it was the prosperity decade will completely change the way Americans view the economy. So, what exactly led to this? Again, there's never any one single factor, whether it's talking about a good economy or bad economy. It's always a multitude of them. And first and foremost, and this is so important to know, it's because the world economy was destroyed. Same will be true after World War II. So when we look back at the 1920s and the 1950s and 60s, and we ask why can't we recreate that, part of the reason was because the United States economy was unscathed compared to the rest of the world. So that is first and foremost. Also, during a huge change that will take place in the 1920s is the United States adopts consumer culture. This is vastly different than all of U.S. history before this. Throughout U.S. history, Americans had valued frugality and thrift, but in the 1920s, that is when we first start getting into consumer culture, where to be a good American, you consume and you buy stuff. And it is also when the advertising industry really took off. This is, it's not the very beginning of it, but this is when it really, really took off. The golden age of advertising is 1950s and 60s, but in the 1920s it became a huge industry. Throughout the decade, it became about a $4 billion industry, and consumer culture became a thing. And to be a good American, you would consume. Look at these advertisements. So humiliating when she realized the cause of her husband's frigidity. Everyone owns a car but us. Married, no reason to neglect SA, significant other, or stalking appeal. They're making men feel guilty for not buying stuff. The phenomenal advertising. And Americans started putting value in consuming. And this became part of American culture, which it has been ever since. Americans' first importance to his country is no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer. Consumption is a new necessity. So Americans' idea of consumption just fundamentally changed, and it has not gone back. And there were a lot of really exciting things to buy. So consumerism was a cultural shift, a major, major cultural shift. And one reason that Americans could get into consumerism more isn't just because the economy was doing well. It's also because for the first time, Americans invented credit, or buying on installment. So we have credit cards are later, but this is when we first get installment buying. So instead of having to put everything down at one time, now people could buy or get the things that they want and pay in installments. Again, this kind of getting into debt like this was unheard of before the 1920s, but it is what really allowed for the consumer culture to take off. And Americans, they really got into this, especially home appliances. Something like 80% of home appliances were bought in installments. By 1927, the United States, American consumers had about $3 billion in debt. I know today that sounds like nothing, and it is nothing for today, but again, this is a brand new thing, buying on credit. So the consumer culture was really, it was able to take off because of installment buying. And what people were buying there were a lot of things, but the biggest thing were home appliances, which was only possible because of electrification. Obviously, electricity was created a long time before this, but this is when electricity got into people's homes. So at the start of the decade, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of homes had electricity, and by the end of the decade, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 70, unless you're not including farms, and then it was like 85% of homes. Rural areas won't get electricity till later. We'll get into that. But so 85% of homes, not in rural areas, had electricity. And there was all this cool stuff to buy. Vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, all sorts of great stuff. And one of the most popular things was the radio. This is the golden age of the radio. It had been created before this, obviously for military purposes, but this is when it got into people's homes. So now one of the most popular things to buy on installment was the radio. And it completely changed American society. It made American society more homogenous because everyone's listening to the radio. And all of a sudden, people in rural Alabama can now hear the same thing as people in New York City. So it is pulling the United States together in a huge way. And also, every single new industry like this is leading to a lot of other industries. So obviously, you have the people that make the radios. Then you have the people that make radio shows. And you have people that make radio towers. So it was a boom for the U.S. economy. And the single most popular thing in the 1920s that boosted the U.S. economy was the automobile. Obviously, the automobile wasn't new. It had been around since the early 1900s. But automobiles became much more widespread. And people were able to get them because of buying them on credit, which most people did. But also, new ways of production made it so they were a lot cheaper. So Henry Ford, especially, is the person most famous for making cars much faster, much more efficient. Do you remember the efficiency movement from the Progressive era and Taylorism? He is the person that brought that to the automobile industry. And he was able to produce cars so much faster with the objective that everyone could buy them. My goal is to democratize the automobile. When I'm through, everybody will be able to afford one, and about everyone will have one. And so he also, like Taylorism had recommended, he paid his workers more. It's part of the welfare capitalism. So he paid his workers really well, and he created the assembly line, which made it so cars could be produced so much faster. And because they could be produced so much faster, the price of cars, of his Model T, for example, it went from like $850 in 1910 to, in 1924, they were selling for like $290. So the price was so much lower that now everyone could afford one. Not everyone. A lot of people could afford one, and people bought them up like crazy. The automobile was, this is a huge factor in the economy doing well, because think about everything that goes into this. Obviously, you have to have the workers, but then you have to buy the steel, you have to buy the rubber, you have to buy all the different parts for the car from other places. But then there are all sorts of other industries that come from that, from the automobile. This 1920s was a decade where road construction was huge. So that also requires other workers, requires buying cement, requires buying all sorts of things to make roads. You have service stations, you have car repairs. So all of these other things all of these other parts of the economy were booming because of the mass production of cars. It is a good economy is always one part of a booming economy is always new technology, and it's not that the car was new, but the ability to produce it fast was new, just like with radio. So it becoming widely available to the majority of Americans. So you had new forms of industry, new methods of production that were making things much more widely available, and you were having new items that people had never had before, like refrigerators and like the home appliances that they could now get because of the electrification of their homes. So you had all these things making the economy just boom. And one thing that is always associated with a good economy is construction. When the economy is doing well, their construction and a good economy just go hand in hand. And construction was a huge part of the 1920s. Part of the reason was because Florida. This is when Florida actually became a very popular place, and people started moving to Florida in huge numbers. This is when it became overall, there were people there before, but it became populated. And a lot of it was because of advertising. They advertised how great it was. There were entire magazines just devoted to the Florida land boom. And just the construction in Florida was insane. Like, there were lumber companies that would just send lumber to Florida without having a buyer because they knew someone would buy it to build. There are entire books written about the Florida boom, and it was enormous. Like, railroads or trains were just constantly going into it to drop off supplies so they could build. So it was a massive, Florida alone was a massive part of it, but there was obviously construction other places, including skyscrapers. There were a lot of huge skyscrapers built in the 1920s, and obviously, just think of how much goes into building skyscrapers. Skyscrapers, I mean, just the amount of labor and the amount of material that goes into it made this an absolutely booming decade. So, for all these reasons, the U.S. economy in the 1920s, it looked fantastic. And it was super exciting. There's all this stuff to buy. This is a side note that you won't be tested on, but if you want to know also why China's economy, one big reason China's economy has done so well in the last couple decades, and why it looks like a miracle and it's gone up so much, is because of construction. China put a ton of money into construction, and you can Google ghost towns of China, but I'll just show you a few pictures. They basically have entire cities that no one lives in. It's part of the reason China's economy has done so well is because they've just done massive construction projects that no one lives in. They have huge cities, and individuals have bought apartments in these cities where no one lives. Those are empty. Those are all empty apartments. They have entire cities that are replicas of European countries, like Paris, that no one lives in. They're completely empty. That's why China's economy is going to collapse because a lot of its growth has been built on just construction for construction's sake. And it's not actually useful or productive, and no one's going to be living in a lot of them. I think the number I read last, and this could be wrong, was there's 64 million apartments that no one will ever live in. Not including some of the mansions that the entire cities of mansions that they built. So China's economy, it was built on something. Its economy is booming because of something that was unstable. Just like in the 1920s, the prosperity decade, it looked great. And from about 1921 to about 1927, it was fantastic. But obviously, it will come crashing down.